The first episode of Loki was absolutely fantastic. I don't know where Kevin Feige was hiding all of this talent. Perhaps he sequestered it from the rest of the MCU projects because this is like nothing that has come out of Marvel in the past few years. Episode 1, titled Ouroboros, starts off where the finale left off in season 1. Loki was kicked through a time door by Sylvie at the end of time. He showed back up at the TVA, but when he got there, Mobius and Hunter B-15 didn't recognize him. This leads into the two main crises of this episode: time slipping and the destruction of the TVA itself. Loki is being forcefully moved between the past and the present of the TVA, and he differentiates the past and the present not only by the fact that his former allies can't recognize him, but by the statues of Kang that are present throughout the TVA. These statues are present in both time periods, but in the present, they're hidden by murals and other things. Now, I briefly want to mention that when Loki was in the past, he stumbled upon a recording of He Who Remains, or possibly just Kang at that point, talking to Ravonna Renslayer, the judge from season 1. Basically, they spoke to each other as if they were going forward to lead what I assume to be the TVA at some point. Now, at the end of season 1, Renslayer walked through a time door and she seemed to be seeking He Who Remains. Also in the episode, it was revealed through the actions of Hunter B-15 that Ravonna Renslayer had a variant who was a school teacher named Rebecca Termine, I think it's how it's pronounced. This variant is a reference to the comics. In Marvel Comics, there's an alternate universe Ravonna Renslayer named Rebecca Termine, and she actually goes back in time to the year 1903 to try and reconcile with a version of Kang named Victor Timely. From the trailers, we know that we're going to see Renslayer in a time period where it looks like she's dressed as a person from the early 1900s. We also know from both the post-credits scene of Ant-Man and the Wasp: Quantumania, as well as those trailers, that Victor Timely, a version of Kang, will also appear in the series. If you want to know more about the relationship between Kang and Ravonna, I'll leave a link to my Kang Explained video at the end. While Loki is exploring the past TVA and realizing how much has been covered up in the future, Mobius and B-15 end up going to the war room of the TVA to meet with Judge Gamble and General Dox. They convene to discuss the destruction of the sacred timeline as well as the revelation that all of the TVA members are variants. Essentially, the discussion revolves around how the TVA should proceed and whether or not to tell everyone that they are in fact variants. Obviously, Mobius and Hunter B-15 want everyone to be free to choose what they do with their lives now, but General Dox seems very zealous in her role as a hunter and wants to continue pruning the timelines, despite admitting that the timekeepers were fake. Hunter B-15 reminds her that they're not just pruning timelines, they are actually killing trillions upon trillions of lives, which is a reference to Ant-Man and the Wasp: Quantumania, when it showed Kang's past, where he traveled the multiverse, personally decimating universes. You could argue that it's done much more humanely now, but they're still essentially erasing the lives of who knows how many people. And so the two timelines kind of collide when Loki is in the war room in the past and then ends up in the same spot in the present. So Loki appears and basically tells the war room that Sylvie killed He Who Remains, and then he and Mobius kind of recap. Loki tells them a little bit about He Who Remains and how he was holding the sacred timeline together, and how it might be the right thing to do because of all the possible Kang variants, but it's also evil at the same time. Basically, he just wants to find Sylvie again, but he is still time slipping. At the same time that Loki is going through these revelations about Sylvie and He Who Remains, there seems to be something wrong with the TVA. Basically, the temporal loom is the power source and the creation of the branches of time, and it's in overdrive because it's not used to creating so many branches. But before they can solve this crisis, they have to stop Loki from time slipping. So Mobius takes Loki to the Office of Repairs and Advancement, and that's where we meet a character named Ouroboros, who seems to be the only person in the TVA who didn't have their memory tampered by He Who Remains. I forgot to mention earlier that Loki has determined that people don't realize Kang had been there at one point leading the TVA, and that the statues had always been there, suggesting that they must have had their memories erased possibly multiple times. However, Ouroboros, being somebody who has a very solitary work life, and nobody really visits him, so I guess He Who Remains didn't see him as someone who was necessary to get a memory reset. Anyways, Loki continues to time slip from the past to the present, but by doing so, he's able to work with Mobius and both versions of Ouroboros to figure out that they have to prune Loki. They would then use what's called a temporal aura extractor, capture his temporal essence, and that will allow him to be rooted in the present. After they figure this all out and Mobius is ready to set up the extractor, Loki time slips again, but this time into the future of the TVA. Now, while he's running around the future trying to find a time stick to prune himself when the moment comes, Mobius puts on this really dorky looking radiation suit. He has to go out into what's basically the temporal version of a nuclear reactor to set up the extractor. It's pretty dangerous because it's essentially emanating time rather than nuclear radiation. So every wave of time coming off of it slowly ages Mobius' suit, and eventually it'll eat its way through, aging him to the point of death. So he has a time limit. But that's exacerbated by the fact that Ouroboros sets a time limit of his own, where he will shut the blast doors in order to protect the TVA, while he fixes the temporal loom to make it handle more than one branch of time. And once it gets to the point where Ouroboros is about to press the button and close the gate, Mobius has to turn around and go back, even though he doesn't want to lose Loki, and he nearly doesn't make it back inside. But in the future, Loki is still looking for a time stick and ends up near an elevator before being pruned. Now, in this elevator, we see Sylvie. However, I don't think Loki is seeing Sylvie, and I don't think Sylvie is seeing this version of Loki. We also don't see who prunes Loki because it's someone behind him, and it cuts away right after. So my theory based on that scene, as well as the trailers, so spoilers if you haven't seen the trailers, is that unless the trailers are a ruse, they show Loki time slipping in other scenes and environments, which means obviously he doesn't permanently fix the problem right now. I also don't believe that he reunites with Sylvie in the TVA. So what I believe happened is that there's a recurring time loop. In this loop, the future Loki actually pruned present Loki in the future, allowing him to live in the present, and then eventually go into the future and prune himself again, creating a kind of loop. I also think Sylvie opening up the elevator and coming to the TVA is something that's going to happen in the future with either a future Loki or somebody else. And so that's where the episode mainly wraps up. The only other thing that happens is that General Dox takes an army of Minutemen, and she says they're going to go after Sylvie at the end of time. Now, it is possible that that's exactly what's going to happen, but what I think is more likely is that with all these men and all the weapons they have, that they're actually going to go prune all the branches. In the post-credit scene for this episode, Sylvie ends up in 1982 Broxton, Oklahoma, which is a Thor Easter egg. In 2007, Marvel Comics brought Thor back to life after having killed him off in 2004. When he came back to life, he rebuilt the city of Asgard using magic, and for some reason, decided to have it floating above the city of Broxton, Oklahoma. I'm not sure what the significance of 1982 is, unless the writers at Marvel just wanted to show us an old-fashioned McDonald's, which is where Sylvie ends up. She basically goes to order food, and when the guy asks her what she wants, she says she wants to try everything. And unless I'm reading too much into it, I think this pertains not only to the food, but also suggests that she might try to live out different lives in a number of different realities. Additionally, from the trailers, it seems like Loki and Mobius, when they search for Sylvie, end up at this McDonald's where she's working. So unless the trailer is misdirection, I believe they won't find her until episodes 3 or 4, and she'll still be in this timeline. There were a few other Easter eggs that I haven't talked about yet. One of them was the existence of Judge Gamble. There's actually a character named Justin Gamble in the comics who was a worker at the TVA. He wasn't a judge, but he was someone who disagreed with the TVA's methods. Basically, the TVA had built these robots called incinerators, and they kind of did what the Minutemen do, which is go around and just prune timelines. He was against that, but the TVA wouldn't change their methods, so he left and ended up traveling through time, and the incinerators chased after him. Now, the incinerators at one point went by the name Dreadlocks, which I think might connect to another Easter egg towards the end of the credits, where we see a book called the Zartan Contingency. So Zartan is actually a G.I. Joe character. He's basically a master of disguise. He's good at using makeup and technology to disguise himself and blend into his environment. He's also an assassin and an escape artist. And he led a group called the Dreadnoks. So I could be reaching, but I think they wouldn't have put that book there unless it was a clear reference. So I believe that Zartan could either be referencing Loki or Sylvie because they use illusions and trickery to escape, but I think it could also reference General Dox maybe not being what she seems, and also leading this rogue group of Minutemen to prune the timelines, and perhaps at some point they'll be called the Dreadlocks. We'll have to wait and see if that Easter egg actually ends up meaning anything. And then another Easter egg is this dial, which may have appeared in the credits of season 1, I couldn't remember. But with the separate numbers around it, it's obviously not a clock. Instead, it has numbers like 0, 461, 121, 215, and so on. The image will be up on the screen. And my hypothesis is that they're actually different realities and that the dial is related to a machine that possibly travels to them. By doing a little digging, I couldn't find anything in Marvel Comics pertaining to most of these realities except for reality 0. Now, the 0 could just simply be the baseline of whatever this dial does, or it could represent the TVA itself. If it is, there is an Earth 0 in Marvel Comics. It's currently called Earth 01, but originally it was designated Earth 0, and this world was the home of the Inheritors. The Inheritors are basically a group of what's called totem hunters, and they feed off the animal totems, which are essentially like people with animal spirits attached to them and magic and some other stuff. For example, Spider-Man is known as the spider totem, so the inheritors have chased him in different universes to basically feed off his essence. The world that they inhabit includes a temple called Loom World that holds the web of life and destiny, which is somewhat similar to the temporal loom. So obviously calling the center of the TVA the temporal loom, I think there might be a connection there, though I don't think it goes beyond the fact that the MCU is simply taking aspects of the TVA from the comics and aspects of Loom World and basically putting them together. I don't believe we'll see any inheritors in the Loki series. But man, that was a great episode. You definitely need to rewatch the end of season 1 to really get it. It does recap and provide some exposition, but this episode also functions more as a continuation of the finale rather than an episode of a new season. But I thought the acting was great, the writing was excellent, and I didn't notice any issues with the CGI. Despite the comedy and levity, the writers took the serious moments seriously. I honestly thought that Mobius was going to die when he didn't make it to the gate, and that Loki would have to start over in some other timeline. Also, during the scene when Loki was in the future, the atmosphere of that scene and the score reminded me a lot of the Netflix series Dark, which also deals with time travel and is an awesome series. So I don't know if that was actually a reference or not, but I thought it was cool. You know my thoughts on this episode. Let me know yours in the comment section below. As always, if you enjoyed this video, please hit that like and subscribe button, as well as hitting the notification bell so you never miss out on a new video. Thanks for watching.